if you read the papers about the models, the modelers say, depending on the assumptions, we can show sea level deceleration or linearity or accelerations.
From rising sea levels to surging forest fires to dying polar bears to disappearing coral reefs, much of what we've been told about climate change is just not true, says Michael 쉘lenberger, the author of Apocalypse Never and founder of Public.News.
I think that those scientists that manipulate the data to show certain things, I think they really are apocalyptic. Like, they really think that the world is going to come to an end, but then they look at their data and their data don't show that, so then they have to mess with it.
At the same time, Bill Gates has recently come out to declare the quote doomsday view of climate change is wrong. Are we seeing a shift away from climate alarmism and the net zero agenda? This is American Thought Leaders, and I'm Yanya Kellick. Michael 쉘lenberger, so good to have you back on American Thought Leaders.
Jan, great to be back with you.
So, Michael, is the era of climate extremists destroying priceless works of art now over?
That's a really interesting question. It feels like it's coming to an end. I mean, we still see, as you mentioned, vandalism, most recently against Stonehenge. In fact, those protesters got let off the hook by the courts for what they did. I think in terms of legitimacy, yeah, I mean, climate extremism, I think, has lost a lot of legitimacy over the last 5 or 6 years. The most kind of obvious part of that is Bill Gates recently said that we really shouldn't look at climate separate from human welfare, separate from human, like how we're doing, at a human level. And on that, on those metrics, we're doing well. I mean, we are more resilient to extreme weather events. The number of disasters has gone down because the number of deaths and the cost of disasters has gone down. So fewer people are dying from hurricanes and floods and all the other things that were supposed to hurt us. And then I think most dramatically, I think, and others finally understand that there was a manipulation going on a lot of other data, including your organization, which was censored by Facebook for sharing accurate information about the fact that there's been no decline in sea ice in the Arctic for 20 years. And then we've also seen now it's clear that the activist scientists were manipulating models to show an acceleration in sea level rise, when the only long-term reliable source of data, which is called tide gauge data, just measuring the tides, shows no acceleration from the 1850s on. And that doesn't mean that that climate isn't changing. I think the planet is changing. It doesn't mean that humans don't have an influence. I think we do have an influence. But the size of that influence, I think, for me, it's even less than maybe I thought a few years ago. I was reporting, even after I wrote Apocalypse Never, my book from 2020 on environmental alarmism, I was still repeating the ostensible scientific view that sea levels that the rise was accelerating. I don't think I can say that anymore. That's part of the reason I wrote those recent pieces. But then when you just go through all the other metrics, yeah, I mean, there's just not really any case to be made.
I want to touch on one other thing. I went to a round table of basically energy experts. Real Clear Politics organized it here in DC recently. But as it went around, I thought to myself, wait a second, all these people are talking about right now is how are we going to get enough energy into these AI data centers? It's an existential crisis. And I thought to myself, wait a sec, is net zero dead? Is degrowth actually dead? And I asked that question, and essentially what everybody would tell me is there's no more talk about net zero, and so this information that you're bringing forth kind of fits with this rubric, but it also makes me wonder if this isn't sort of a convenient revealing of information at an appropriate time, as everyone seems to be maddeningly gearing up to build as many data centers and electricity production facilities as possible.
Yeah, I mean, look, anytime you see such a big change in the discourse and the kind of conventional wisdom as measured by Bill Gates, I would say he kind of represents the left end of the conventional wisdom. And So his announcement is coming at a time, as you rightly point out, that the main focus of policymakers, and probably in both parties, though certainly in the Republicans, but probably also in the Democrat Party too, is just getting enough energy to power the data centers. And we see we need more electricity. Electricity prices have been going up largely in response to renewables and these renewables policies. But there's also just rising demand. And I think that's just a huge factor that is changing the conversation. But it's a lot of things. I mean, there's a lot of people that for years have been pointing out that the data is just not there for an alarmist case. And not only that, but actually the system, the so-called energy system is doing a pretty good job on its own of decarbonizing. Just there's so much more abundant natural gas, some of it not even being tapped. So I think in the United States, by the way, the conversation has completely changed, and now we're a pro-energy growth country. Europe, it hasn't. So the British are still not tapping into their natural gas reserves that they have. They're still trying to do a lot of wind, which is making electricity expensive. Germany is in a state of degrowth and deindustrialization. And I think in some ways it's just, committing suicide as a nation through its energy policies. But I think that where things are headed, I think where the left is going to have to go is going to have to go towards more abundant energy production. And that's going to be from things like natural gas and nuclear that were, verboten just a few years ago.
Well, this is another thing that I heard at that roundtable. It's clear that nuclear is going to be sort of full steam ahead, quite literally, I suppose. But, you actually did your work in your book, Apocalypse Never. This is actually how we actually met, looking at all these questions. But it's very interesting that you were saying that your own research hadn't told you how far it had gone, how far this manipulation actually went. That I find that quite astonishing.
Yeah, I think on a couple of points, and I just published another interview with Judith Curry, who's a climate scientist, atmospheric scientist, professor emerita at Georgia Tech, kind of unquestionable credentials, thinks humans are having an impact on the climate. I asked her, so what percentage did she think that we were responsible with our both land use changes, which is also underestimated probably, as well as our carbon emissions? And she said, probably 50%. The conventional wisdom is that humans are 100% responsible for all the warming. She said probably somewhere around 50%. The other thing that I thought was interesting is that, we were headed into, she thinks that we would be headed into a cooling period if we were not contributing greenhouse gases to warming the planet. And then the third most kind of, jarring part of this is that, and it's not controversial at all, actually, is that warming is much better than cooling. And so, just at a simple matter of deaths from cold significantly outnumber deaths from heat. Those three things, that there's still a lot of natural variability in this complicated planet system that we have. We don't totally understand it. It's hard to measure it exactly. That that really we might be cooling now if it weren't for our interventions of our unintended effects of warming, and that warming can be good. And so if all else being equal, it's literally the opposite of pessimism. You'd kind of be on the side of like, wow, we kind of lucked out in a variety of ways. This is not reason for any apocalyptic thinking, and therefore all of the apocalyptic thinking is really motivated by other things, including I think the heart of it is a kind of Malthusian, anti-human, humans are bad, they're a cancer on the earth, there's too many of them. Everybody knows that story because we teach it to our kids, and it's like a staple of Hollywood movies and television. But that's kind of what motivated a lot of it. And even I look at the sea level scientists that I think were involved in mischief. There's certainly more truth in climate change than there is in, say, transgenderism, but they just exaggerated it to such an extent that it really became the opposite of what it is, which is something that that it's not the end of the world. It's not entirely from humans. And it's certainly better, to the extent to which we're going to have some impact on the planet, it's certainly better to be in the direction of warming than cooling.
Thank you for tuning in to American Thought Leaders. In a world where spin and agendas dominate the headlines, I'm proud to bring you unfiltered insights from the brightest minds in America, from a relative outsider Canadian perspective. To keep this possible and to access even more exclusive content, in-depth documentaries, in our daily digital newspaper, consider subscribing to the Epoch Times today. It's your way to support independent journalism. Just hit the link in the description below to subscribe and unlock the full American Thought Leaders experience and so much more. You can try it today for just $1 a week. So just hit the link in the description below. And now back to the interview. You know, in your interview with Judith Curry, which I perused, that was kind of the most striking thing, was just simply her assertion. The most important thing to know is that global warming isn't actually bad, isn't actually dangerous. And somehow yet we have, as you point out in your recent piece, there's all sorts of people that have been driven to, mental illness, to being extreme, as I mentioned at the beginning, of destroying we're going to the great efforts to destroy priceless works of art, that are caught in this kind of, social contagion of climate alarmism, while in reality, it's actually something that's at least neutral, if not positive.
Yeah, and that means you have to look for different causes, that certainly scientists who are motivated misled people, but people were inclined to be catastrophic in ways that they weren't in the past. I mean, I always point out one of the other pieces of data, because we had this big heat spell, we basically had faster sea level rise from the 20s to the 50s than we did from the 50s to the 80s. And then we've had a faster rise since the 90s, but not significantly faster than that period from the 20s to the 50s. That's also accompanied by a spike in heat waves in the 30s. Well, I went back and just for fun, I read all of the New York Times coverage of the heat waves in the 1930s. And Jan, what was so interesting about it is how relaxed they were. I mean, they had hundreds of people were dying in heat waves, like in buildings, and the New York Times people were kind of downplaying it. Back, I mean, you're in the midst of the Great Depression, right? It's 1930s. It's there's it's also the Dust Bowl period, right? So people, it's bad times, and they're kind of like, well, yeah, the heat wave is like the least of it. Whereas I think that it's really has to do with a lot of different things, obviously, for it to be such a big phenomenon. I mean, part of it is just what I was saying about a kind of anti-human ideology. I think some of it is some class interests that are served by wanting to promote certain things like renewables or financializing carbon emissions through carbon markets at the United Nations. And there's the power trips, the attention for Greta Thunberg or the United Nations Secretary General or the president or former president or other politicians. They get some narcissistic rewards. And then you can't help but notice that it's an apocalyptic discourse, which sociologists and historians have studied for hundreds of years. A millenarian, end of the world is nigh. We have a lot of psychological studies of the kind of people attracted to those those apocalyptic cults. These are sort of lost souls, people that are really kind of a lot of failed artists. I noticed that that's a kind of a category of folks involved in those the vandalism protests. But, people used to have in the United States, mostly a Christian, belief system. And it had a story about original sin and, and then the end of times, the revelations. Well, when people stop believing in that, they don't really stop needing a kind of cosmological explanation of things. It sort of emerges organically through the culture, I think, that sort of apocalyptic story. And I think a sense of, at a time when, it was a time of anxiety, as the Cold War was over, we had a stand-in apocalyptic event in the form of the risk of nuclear war. When that goes away at the end of communism is when in the early 90s, that's when you see climate changing emerging as an apocalyptic story. So, to sum it all up, I would just say I think the climate alarmism was a kind of, a generalized anxiety disorder among, college-educated elites who were trying to sort of virtue signal, feel good about themselves, give their lives purpose and meaning. It's not to downplay the financial interests or the kind of the power tripping by various people, but I think in some ways it's just a disordered psychological or spiritual response from people that, have lost their faith.
Yeah, and there's this other element of very deliberate manipulation, which is something that you highlight in this recent work that you've done. And you alluded to it a little bit earlier when you were talking about, that the trends change over time. So if you pick a very specific time and you avoid mentioning the context of that, you can make something look really dramatic and problematic that actually isn't. But can you trace for me some of the major ways in which, you can see this deliberate manipulation actually happening?
Yeah, sure. Well, it's fascinating. Even if you're not interested in climate change, watching people that are very dogmatic about something, people that are in their own dream world, sort of manipulate things. Because I think that those scientists that manipulate the data or manipulate their studies to show certain things, I think they really are apocalyptic. Like, they really think that the world is going to come to an end. But then they look at their data and their data don't show that. So then they have to mess with it. So in terms of the sea level rise, really you just have this one set of data from tide gauges around the world. And when just doesn't matter how you've got to do some corrections and whatnot, but basically anybody that looks at that body of data says we can't see a long-term acceleration. You can pick periods of acceleration and deceleration, 1920 to 1950, 1990 to today. But then when you just go and say, oh, but then you didn't see that during these other decades, well, then it's not a long-term trend. And climate change is just, long-term weather. It's just climate is this thing we call climate. It's a period of time, usually, 30, 60, 120 years. And so if you're seeing natural variability over 30-year cycles, well, then you can't say that that's a trend of increased acceleration of sea level rise. Sea level has been rising since at least the 19th century. That was also when we started studying it. But then what they do is they say, okay, well, then we have to go find other measures. So they'll then use other measures. They love satellite data. That requires a lot of assumptions. Then there's all these other indirect measures like salt marshes or coral. They're indirect. You have to ask yourself, why are you even using indirect measures if you have a direct measure in the form of tide gauge data? And the answer is because they can't show an acceleration otherwise. That's the real answer. I made public my email debate with the main guy. His name is Robert Kopp. He's at Rutgers University, very famous left-wing university. And, you can see him when I sort of call him out on this, because, for example, they'll put it all in these models and then they'll say, oh, the models, they show an acceleration. And you kind of go, well, but if you read the papers about the models, the modelers say, depending on the assumptions, we can show sea level deceleration or linearity or acceleration. So they're just different model outputs. And then they just, there's so much going on in these studies. I mean, you're talking like hundreds or thousands of studies that then get boiled down into a single report for the UN IPCC that then get boiled down to a summary for policymakers, which then becomes press releases, which then becomes the statements by the scientists, all of which filter you up into a more apocalyptic or alarmist direction. But most people just miss the fact that, and they say irresponsibly, IPCC says high confidence in acceleration. Well, you can't have high confidence. You can't have any confidence in any direction at all because you can show acceleration, deceleration, or linearity. So that's just one thing. Yeah, that's just sea level rise. And by the way, that's the one that I'm somewhat proud of that investigation, because that was one where, like, the headlines in the nowhere show the story I'm telling you. It still hasn't, been picked up yet properly. I think it will be. But whereas, like, on the Arctic sea ice, on the island atolls, the islands are supposed to be underwater, we have seen headlines that directly say, scientific papers, headlines. Polar bears is another one. Like when I had checked for Apocalypse Never 6 years ago, there was no way to show whether polar bear populations have increased or decreased. Now the main scientific group says, they bury it though, that there's been an increase. So some of it is cherry picking. It's kind of maybe the main thing, model manipulation, and then kind of burying it. Like they also on heat waves, EPA, which should be fixing this under Trump, but the old EPA, they hide. I say hide. I'm not making it. I don't know that they're deliberately. I can't prove they're deliberately hiding it. But if you just Google EPA and heat waves, you get the heat waves from 1960. You don't get the one from the whole 20th century where you get this huge spike in the 1930s. And so you're kind of like, why are you? Well, we all know why they're doing that, because they want to give the alarmist presentation. So they're sort of, it's really cherry picking is probably the right single word to describe what they're doing, but also some model manipulation, and then just hiding a lot of these other findings so that most people that don't want to spend a lot of time reading these documents, most of them end up never seeing.
So is this the same thing that happened when it comes to catastrophic weather or hurricanes and damage? I mean, on the one hand, there just isn't an increase in these factors that I'm aware of. On the other hand, the reporting tells you there's this dramatic increase, and that's evidence of this, the apocalyptic vision, or the evidence that it's an existential issue and so forth. Or was this just simply misrepresenting reality? Which is it?
Yeah, it's very similar. I think the extreme weather has a lot of similarities to the sea level rise manipulations. Let's take kind of the biggest one by far is hurricanes. If you properly measure hurricanes over 100, 150 years, there's been no increase in landfalling hurricanes during that time. Like, full stop. There's just no trend. I think I've seen some people actually produce a slightly declining trend, but basically no trend in landfalling hurricanes. Now, we do have new ways to measure hurricanes, which is with satellite data. So if you don't adjust the data to account for better detection of hurricanes, and you don't do landfalling hurricanes, for example, if you do all hurricanes, because of course, then you can show an increase because the satellites are better at detecting hurricanes offshore now, obviously, than just, like, is there a hurricane out there?
Yeah.
So there's actually two graphs I point out, one by Financial Times, one by the New York Times, that do two different manipulations. The Financial Times doesn't correct for the change of technology to measure hurricanes. So it's completely irresponsible. I mean, I don't know how else to say. It's misinformation. I mean, or disinformation, depending on what they understood. The New York Times then does the time series trick. So you don't have a long enough period of time to show a trend. In other cases, it's sort of somewhat different. On the fires, it's multiple things, because there's sort of the total amount of land that's on fire has declined. So you can't say that climate change has caused an increase in the amount of land on fire. But even on that, Jan, it's also, even that's almost a misleading piece of data, because fire is not necessarily bad. A lot of our forests need fire. Fire clears out the underbrush. It often allows the seeds to be able to germinate. And so it's not like even fires are bad. It might be that we should have more fires, right? In some places, it depends. But then the other one is the high intensity fires. And this is the craziest one. And I was absolutely like pilloried for saying this at the time. And now I look back and think I didn't say it even strong enough. All of the increase of high intensity fires, all of it, can be explained by poor forest management. You just allow woody debris to accumulate, and you're going to get these big bonfires in the forest that are bad in the sense that they burn the crowns of the trees and destroy the whole tree, as opposed to these low level, less hot fires that's natural and good and positive in terms of burning out the undergrowth. So all of it is about forest management. And then they would say, well, you can't say that there's not some role of climate change. And I guess what I would say is, yeah, slightly warmer weather, you could say, added some kind of unmeasurable additional heat, but it's so small and irrelevant compared to the accumulation of wood fuel that adding it as a cause, and it's all through modeling, is the other thing. They can't show it. That's your first sign that there's some mischief that they're doing, because you have to ask, well, why are we modeling it at all if we have real world data?
And then there's this other piece. I noticed you mentioned it in your piece, which is coral declines, right? And you mentioned that the Great Barrier Reef is, sort of blooming like never before, or at least in recent history. Um, how does coral fit into this?
Another big one, right? I mean, great. Anybody that was, old enough to remember of all the things we were worried about, we were worried about a big coral die-off on the Great Barrier Reef, and every year there were new headlines about the corals it's just getting worse and worse. There was just one headline, and then in 2022 they said it's record coral, and I think 2020. And by the way, Facebook banned that story, that accurate story in 2020. They banned one of the most respected Australian researchers of coral, Peter Ridd, in 2022. 2023, Facebook relented because they had 2 years of data showing record. But Jan, it's not even that it was a 35-year record. That's how long they've been studying it. Because there's so many of these. I mean, I think I counted like 7 climate impacts where they had completely misrepresented them. But the other one, I don't even know if it was in that one, was just the greening of the earth. There's more CO2, so there's more CO2 that's being absorbed, more plant life, more tree life. Mostly we like that because we like green, and green is good for all sorts of reasons: local air pollution, setting aside climate change. But that's this thing that there's not like there's nobody like arguing against that. That's just everybody knows that's happening. But they find these ways. Carbon Brief is the really bad actor on this. They find these ways to sort of say that it's sort of not happening, or that it's being simplified. Like, because Judy Curry was part of this Department of Energy review of the climate science that they put out in the spring, and Carbon Brief does this response. And I was reading, and I couldn't even barely understand what they were saying. It was such word salad. It was such like you were. So I finally asked, I was like, read it to Judy Curry. Basically, they were saying, oh, but it's not just the carbon dioxide. It's also greater warming, right? And it's like, well, okay, so then, but you're saying the greater warming is all from more carbon dioxide anyway. But so great, it's more warming and more CO2. Like, that doesn't mean that it's not the CO2 as well. And I just was like, why are they doing that, to Judy? And she's like, because they don't want to admit that there could be something good about global warming. They don't want to admit that there might be something good about CO2. So we're not really talking about like global warming, are we? You were talking about your particular version of theological evil.
So, one issue that you've been working on for a very long time is promoting nuclear power as a solution, as an energy solution. And, I guess, you're seeing suddenly the beginnings of the realization of your quest here. How does that feel?
It feels great, Jan. Thank you for asking. It was a lot of grief trying to say, as an environmentalist and Gen Xer raised on fear of nuclear power, I took a lot of grief over speaking out for nuclear, pointing out just how superior it is to renewables. I mean, orders of magnitude better. So it's been enormously satisfying, particularly the change in public opinion. I mean, it's 61% public approval in the United States of nuclear power. Renewables, I believe, are at 52%. When I first started making the case for nuclear back around 2016, those numbers were reversed. I mean, renewables actually, I think, were in the 70s in terms of public approval. Nuclear, I believe, was in the 40% area. So it's been a huge change, and I think it's inspiring in that way. The bad news is that all the stuff I was warning about, that nuclear plants are being shut down, we did lose a fair number of them, saved a bunch of them, saved the nuclear plant in California, saved a couple of plants in Illinois and New York, South Korea, made the case in Europe, but they're still shutting down nuclear plants in Germany, lost a couple in the United States. It's a mixed thing. I mean, Facebook, Meta needs so much power for their server farms that they bought all the power from 3 Mile Island. That's the one reactor that has been operating since 1979. The reactor right next to it melted in 1979, and people thought that was some apocalyptic event. Actually proved the overall safety of the worst form of accident of a nuclear plant. Had melted. and the radiation was contained in the containment dome, just like it had been designed to do. And now everybody wants that power, desperate for that cheap nuclear power in a plant that's already built. So now the question is, what do we do to build new nuclear plants? And on this, I'm excited to see there's been talk about, just continuing to build. Once you build a standard water-cooled nuclear plant, a big one like we have in the United States, it's guaranteed to pay for itself. It's just guaranteed. And the reason is that they can run for 92% of the year or so, which is a huge amount of time. They can basically always be on. You can rely on them for your server farms. You have to refuel the time where you can't, the 8% of the year you refuel them or you do a little bit of maintenance, but they're guaranteed to make money. Even if they go way over budget, they're still going to make money, depending on financing and the price of electricity, in the 20th year or the 25th year. And, they can run forever. I mean, you might have to swap out parts, but you're talking about plants that are going to be licensed to run they are licensed for 80 years or more now. So it's a long-term investment. There's a lot of, hope for a whole different kind of nuclear, but I just think my view is you kind of continue to iterate on the kind of nuclear we know how to build and have proven to build, do some experiments, but yeah, I mean, I just think you see Silicon Valley, the Trump administration, a fair number of Democrats, including, Governor of California, have all recognized that nuclear is really amazing. It's really it's the best form of electricity. It's got all these advantages, and we just should be building a lot more of it. We should have been building a lot more of it 20, 30 years ago, but if we couldn't do that, we should at least do so now.
Well, so one of the things I heard, as we were again discussing at this roundtable, RCP roundtable that I was at, well, there were a couple of things. One is that the big challenges, one are financing, which you pointed out, because these are big, basically even the small reactors are big projects with, it takes quite a number of years to kind of get your kind of initial capital back. That's one side of it. The second part is the overregulation. And so I just noticed someone on X, and I can't remember for the life of me who it was, just commenting, we do actually have quite a bit of experience doing nuclear. Look at the US military. Look at how many active long-term nuclear reactors with zero problems have been running, across the US and the military.
Yeah, and I mean, even the regulation, I think, is overstated. So for we just built, I think we should start building at least 2 more of the same reactors that we just got done building in Georgia. They're called the AP1000. And our regulator, which is the best in the world, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, they were there the whole time. I mean, they're standing around, at the construction site, and they're making sure everything is done by the book and at the highest standard. There's been some folks that have tried to make an enemy out of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. I don't think that's accurate or fair. I think that they've been under a lot of pressure, from anti-nuclear people to just become crazy zealots like they are. And they haven't done that, in 50 years. And, I think everyone should try to go as fast as possible, but no faster. Let's just start building. We know how to do it. We have the blueprints, and I think the money is there. I mean, in other words, if you're an investor, the only way that you won't make your money back is if they don't build the plant. And so that's kind of the main thing, is you just have to get yourself so that they, don't stop building it, just build it. But you'll make more or less money depending on how quickly you get it done. But we know how to do it, and you're guaranteed to make your money back as long as you don't succumb to, pressure from crazy people and stop building it.
Well, and there's probably a number of plants, even though this is expensive and laborious, that you can recommission still.
Yeah. That's a huge, boy, you look at places like Germany. I asked my friends, I'm like, boy, have they started taking, or Indian Point in New York is another one where you're like, how far have they, cause you're like, can you just mothball it, till everybody gets a little bit calmer, because if you mothball it, you could potentially bring it back. You can, it's just a big, it's a big power plant. So, you can take parts out and decommission it, but you could still rebuild it. I mean, at the end of the day, I mean, that's why I think a lot of us, we just look at it and it's like vandalism. It's like here you've got this magical machine that produces just huge quantities of electricity, produces essentially no air or water pollution. The water that comes out is clean, a little warmer than normal, but not, nothing wrong with it. The air, there's no smoke coming out of the plants. I mean, they're incredible. To just take them apart and decommission them when they could run for decades longer, it's just like they're just such magnificent pieces of technology. And to see people taking them down, it's like, it's so irrational and superstitious. It's like witch burning or something to be dismantling a nuclear plant.
As we finish up, Michael, something just struck me. We seem to be challenging as a society a whole suite of shibboleths here. And this seems like the next one, although I'm kind of wondering about this one because there's, kind of a sea change in opinion when it comes to the value and need of energy. So I'm wondering if that isn't driving some of that shift in thinking. But again, that's not necessarily a huge problem either. What do you make of this sort of shift? And are you seeing the same thing I'm seeing?
No, I mean, I think, look, we're at an accelerated period in history. I tell my students and my children, pay attention, because this is a very exciting and in many ways dangerous moment. We're in between two epochs, I would say, two periods. I'm now really interested in these big cycles, Declaration of Independence, 1776 to the Civil War, 1865 to 1945 as a second kind of American Republic, post-Civil War, and then the post-World War II era until now, also an 80-year period, 75 to 80 years in that range. And I think it signals now we're moving out of the globalist Pax Americana era into a more nationalist era. I think the United States is still the leader of the Western world, but it's obviously a multipolar world. It's a world with a very, very big and powerful China, less big, less powerful Russia, but nonetheless a Russia that is asserting control over its, the part of the earth that it really feels, that it has sway over. And we're starting to see the United States focus a little bit more on Latin America. So I think that there's a return towards nationalism, I think a return towards other values, that are emerging. I mean, I think a big surge of interest in faith after the assassination of Charlie Kirk is very interesting. I think a renewed appreciation of masculinity after young men have been told that their masculinity and their sexuality are dangerous and toxic, but also a reappreciation of things like discipline and hard work and the necessity for some of these, these older, traditional values. I don't think that's just something that is viewed as entirely conservative anymore. Or I think the country's becoming a bit more conservative in recognizing that you need police officers, you need firefighters. That's more important than, racial sensitivity trainings, that, there's just, I think, a return to basics. Even on schools, we see Mississippi starts teaching its kids just basic reading, that they weren't doing in places like California and that progressives. So I think we're at the beginning of a really different era, and that, it makes sense that we'd come back to nuclear in this period like this, that we'd move away from globalist issues like climate change. I think the whole LGBT issue is falling apart with the backlash against men and women's sports and the medical mistreatment that we've seen with trans medicine. On a whole, obviously migration and a backlash against this mass migration agenda. So it's I think to your point, what's the changes that we've seen in the conversation around energy, the conversations around climate change are all happening at a time when I think we're moving into a really different era of consciousness, to use a fancy word, a period where people are just thinking differently about themselves, about the countries that we live in and about the future. That's, I think, a very different picture than they've had for the last really at least 80 years, if not longer.
Well, and the trend that I'm seeing, and I hope this is right, because I'm also seeing some other trends, but in line with what you're saying, is just a trend in more interest in truth and just reality in itself, as opposed to a kind of utopianism. Would you agree?
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, I think it's we're in a back to reality, and people were really in a trance on a lot of these issues. A trance around renewables, a trance around trans, a trance around asylum and migration. A trance around defunding the police, and we don't need law and order, and we just got to be more compassionate, and then we will solve all of our problems. A trance around teaching kids to read and do math. Oh, we don't have to make them memorize things. They don't have to memorize syllables. They can just learn from context. Yeah, it's progressive utopianism. I mean, it's kind of an old story. It's a very, a fantasy that in some ways is a reaction against some of the realities of life. This, and we're very comfortable, so it's easy to get pulled into those dream worlds because we can, a lot of us can escape them, but particularly the managerial class of professionals, which is the 35% of the country that's college educated, that really has governed the culture, that runs the media, universities, professional associations. They've really let their, dogmas and dream worlds take hold over a large part of the population. Left is in trouble, because of that. The Democrats are in trouble. I mean, even when Trump lost some, public support after the Epstein files, the Democrats' approval ratings did not go up. That's very rare. It's very unusual. Usually, politicians, their approval ratings go up and down together, and the Democrats are really discredited. And you see, even when they try to reform, like when Gavin Newsom tries to pivot a little bit, he gets in trouble with his base because the base of the Democrat Party is so radicalized. 55% of people that identify as on the left say that the murder of Donald Trump might be justified. The share of college students who say that violence might be necessary against a campus speaker rose from under 20% in 2020 to 34% today. It means a third of all college students think that it might be okay to use violence to stop somebody from speaking. These are coddled children. I mean, really, it's curdled, the coddling of these kids. It's gotten so bad. The reaction to the murder of Charlie Kirk, I mean, it's just, you hear about it and then you go look at it. It's shocking. So I think that's just there's still a lot. I mean, it's taken a huge blow in terms of credibility and legitimacy. All of these things that you would see, that was sort of the ways in which the radical left became the mainstream left, the way the radical left kind of took over the Democratic Party on everything, on climate and trans and migration and race and DEI and, all this stuff. I think that's now just taking a huge beating, and that we need there's always going to be a left and a right in politics. So the problem, I mean, in some ways it's like all we have is, that's why you see so many arguments within the right. I think right now you see so many different factions of people on the right arguing about various manner of things, because there's no left that has any credibility to argue with, because their entire agenda has been discredited with somewhere on the order of 55 to 65 or 75 or 80% of the public. That's how bad it is. So I think that future Democrats, I mean, they're probably gonna have to lose a few election cycles, but future Democrats are just not going to look like what Democrats have looked like for the last, decade or more.
Michael, this has been an absolutely fascinating conversation. A final thought?
Just, these are exciting and dangerous times. People should remain aware and vigilant of your surroundings at all moments. I think we do see threats to free speech continuing around the world. That's where my alarm has been the greatest in the recent weeks and months. President Trump defunded a lot of the bad censorship stuff in the United States, particularly at National Science Foundation and Department of Homeland Security. But we just reported on an international gathering at Stanford in September, of censorship officials from the European Union, the United Kingdom, Australia, and Brazil, which are all the worst actors in the West right now. And they are just desperate and the French president just gave a speech last week. They're just all desperate to censor social media. I think that they're in a much weaker place than they were a year ago, but they won't let it go. And I hope it's the demand for censorship that we're seeing out of those places is a kind of final death throes of this pretty discredited set of ideologies. But definitely something worth keeping our eyes on, because I think at moments of transition like the one that we're in, where we're sort of in between periods, in between a kind of globalist era and I think a new nationalist era, I think that's when a lot of dangerous things can happen. So people should definitely be aware that there are continuing threats to our freedom, including the threat of a digital ID, but certainly of censorship. And we need to maintain that vigilance and maintain our demand for free speech.
Well, Michael 쉘lenberger, it's such a pleasure to have had you on again.
It's great to be with you, Jan.
Thank you all for joining Michael 쉘lenberger and me on this episode of American Thought Leaders. I'm your host, Jan Jekielek.